Well, good morning, and here we are again on a Monday morning, and so far the machinery hasn't got a headache. We're uh, managing to go forward and get stuck in, and of course there he is, the man himself is our Philip. Unfortunately, we think that Richard is not well enough to join us, and we send him our best wishes um, because he is a bit poorly. Would you say, Philip?
More than a bit. He doesn't want to go on about it, but you and I know how many hospital visits he's had to make, including one today.
Yeah.
So he really is not well.
No.
And to say that we wish him well is an understatement. And anyway, he'll want the show to go on. And my subject today goes back to Thomas Paine, associated, of course, with Lewis, the author of The Rights of Man, a public house that you frequent named after him. But in 1796, Thomas Jefferson wrote from America to Paine, saying this: "Go on doing with your pen what in other times was done with the sword." In other words, there's no point using violence anymore to achieve social or political change. And then this was adopted some years later, ironically, in a play by a British playwright in 1839, from which comes that immortal line, "The pen is mightier than the sword." Now, you being a journalist for so many years, and I being a Mancunian, I reminded myself of an incident in the early 19th century in St. Petersfield in Manchester that became known as the Peterloo Massacre. Now, in those days, there was a newspaper in Manchester that had a very radical agenda. Basically, male suffrage. This is nothing about suffragettes. Male suffrage was at an all-time low. Only 11% of the male population nationwide had any electoral rights. And the Manchester and Lancashire area, what we would now call Greater Manchester, so including a place like Stockport, where I was brought up, and then going up north beyond Altrincham and Ashton and into Lancashire itself, there were no MPs at all. Anyway, the Manchester Observer, which has nothing to do with the modern Observer, as you will hear, was a liberal newspaper edited and backed by nonconformists, which, of course, in those days was, again, pretty tricky. And it persisted in criticising the political situation, the lack of electoral reform, and also from 1819, after the Napoleonic Wars had finished 4 years earlier, the economy was in a terrible state. There had been harvest failures, economic slumps that would have been more serious than we've experienced. And in the northwest of England, particularly, it being King Cotton, unemployment was massive. And there was no benefits, there was no social aid at all. And then the price of bread, a staple part of the diet, was kept sky high by the Corn Laws. So the Observer was looking at things on two fronts. One, social and political change, and also changes to legislation in the corrupt parliament to improve the lives of the working class. Well, there was at the time a very radical orator called Henry Hunt. And what the Observer did was encouraged what was called the Manchester Patriotic Union to organise a rally in Manchester on St. Peter's Field, and the crowd to be addressed by Henry Hunt. Well, the first of those took place in January of 1819. Hunt was there. He called on the Prince Regent to choose ministers who would repeal the Corn Laws. The magistrates locally in Manchester were getting more and more worried, as were the mill owners. And basically the military and the yeomanry, who were a bunch of amateurs, were put on high alert. So in March of the same year, this time a large crowd gathered. Hunt was not there. They carried with them blankets because they were going to do a march to London to protest at the Houses of Parliament about the situation. So it was a bit like the Jarrow March from the northeast. But this time, the magistrates had had enough, and the Home Secretary ordered the Riot Act to be read, and then the Dragoon Guards were sent in, and the Blanketeers were dispersed, and they never did the march. Well, the Observer wouldn't be quiet, and called another meeting. Now, this meeting was more than a meeting. This was an extremely well-attended assembly on St. Peter's Field, where Hunt and a number of other radicals, as they were perceived, gathered and was going to speak. That was on the 16th of August of 1819. And the meeting, the Observer shouted, was to take in consideration obtaining radical reform in the Common House of Parliament, including the unrepresented inhabitants of Manchester, by electing a person to represent them in Parliament. Well, this was pretty radical stuff in its day. And on that day, 28 regions of Greater Manchester, Cheshire and Lancashire, none of whom had an MP, came from their own areas, 28 areas, unrepresented, and they assembled peacefully on St. Peter's Field. And estimates are at least 30,000. Figures are very hard to come by, but at least 30,000. And Hunt was there with some of his cronies, and he started to speak in a very, very radical way. And so the magistrates sent in special constables to arrest him. They forced their way through to the hustings, which is basically a horse and cart. People tried to stop the constables getting to him, but they did in the end get to him, and he was arrested. And then the magistrate sent in the full police, the cavalry armed with sabres, and then the yeomanry. Now, the yeomanry were a very despised group. They had been mocked again by the Observer in earlier times, calling them the fawning dependents of the great, meaning the mill owners, with many fools. So the Observer hadn't endeared itself to them either. And when they were sent in, things got completely out of hand. And entirely unarmed people were literally cut down. They were sabred, they were trampled, men, women, and children. There were no weapons involved, no violence from them, but they were suppressed in that way. And at least 18 were killed, and initial estimates were up to 700 were injured. And an example of how unpopular to the great and good this was, when one bloke who had had 2 cuts to his head from a sabre attended the Manchester infirmary, the surgeon refused to treat him unless he renounced what he had been assembling for. And the chap refused to deny what he believed in. And so he was never treated and died later that day of his wounds. So it was pretty miserable stuff. And it was said to be generally the bloodiest political event of the 19th century on English soil, and also a political earthquake. But the Manchester Observer went further. The Manchester Observer coined the phrase the Peterloo Massacre. And this was a very deliberate, ironic reference, of course, to the Battle of Waterloo, where so many lives had been lost. And they published this Peterloo Massacre in their paper, and it was, quote, a true and faithful account of the inhuman murders, woundings, and other monstrous cruelties exercised by a set of capital I infernals, brackets, miscalled soldiers, close brackets, upon unarmed and distressed people. So, as I'm sure as a journalist yourself, that's pretty hard stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Well, the editor, a chap called Roe, W-R-O-E, was arrested in 1820, early 1820, because of this, and he was prosecuted for sedition, a seditious publication, and he was found guilty, and he was jailed for a year and had to pay a substantial fine. And so by February of 1820, the paper was raided repeatedly. Other influential people opposed to it, put it to death, basically, and it closed in February of 1820. So there we have an example, do we not, of the pen being used to encourage peaceful protest, but was met by this murderous assault on completely innocent people. And it shocked the establishment to the core, but their reaction in Parliament was not to listen to the radical platform at all. They passed, the MPs, which I repeat, didn't represent the Greater Manchester or Lancashire at all. They passed what were called the 6 Acts. And the 6 Acts were aimed at suppressing any meetings, any public meetings that advocated radical reform. An irony is that another newspaper began in 1821, and it's a newspaper we still have today, which I think you would guess at, wouldn't you, Keith?
Well, my guess is it's the FT.
Oh no, this was a standard newspaper called the Manchester
Guardian.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
But this wasn't the Guardian we know today. The Guardian we know today is pretty left-wing, at best centrist, but pretty left-wing. Well, the original Manchester Guardian that came after the Observer had been shut down was far from the type of paper we read today, because it was founded and owned by the mill owners. So the Guardian, ironically, the Manchester Guardian, became a broadsheet in favour of the great and the good. And it was called by other, because there were other newspapers. For example, there was one called the Manchester and Salford Gazette, who called the Guardian the foul prostitute and parasite of the mill owners. So the Guardian itself would then have been what you and I might call right wing. I mean, I discovered it was only in 1872 when a new editor for the Manchester Guardian came in called C.P. Scott. That was when it started to change. And it started to advocate reform. And then it got stuck into slavery and the Civil War. And he was editor, incredibly, he was editor from 1872 till 1929, making it what we might call the modern Guardian. Well, the event, the existence of this massacre was denied by the authorities for decades. And it was years later that a rather pathetic and very anodyne blue plaque was put up near the field. Then, after political protest nationwide, there was a red plaque raised. This time, the words on the red plaque were a peaceful rally attacked by armed cavalry, leading to deaths and many injuries. And then on the 200th anniversary of the massacre was erected in Manchester Central the Peterloo Memorial, which is a proper sculpture designed by Jeremy Deller. And that really does go to town and represent the horror of what happened. So that's my starter for 10. Right. That's what happened at Peterloo.
Investigation. Yeah.
Now, I did say to you, didn't I, that the penny's mightier than the sword is that adage, and you messaged back saying, yeah, very topical. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, is just going back historically. I think that the pen has had a great influence on events, but I don't know that it has always been mightier than the sword. You mentioned Tom Paine, who really got the conscience of the colonists going, but that ended in bloodshed. I mean, it ended in war. So it was a mixture. And I think that, for instance, you mentioned the Corn Laws. Much closer to home, there were some men hanged for breaking the Corn Laws in Ringmer, or in the farms around Ringmer. So violence has sometimes been exacerbated by the written word, and yet the written word has come out on top eventually. So I think that it's difficult to sort of put a severe dividing line. But if you really want to be radical in thought, of course, perhaps not the written word, but or the pen, but the spoken word, as you go back to when you think about it, much as it's out of favor now, the remarkable revolution that Jesus Christ got going. Never mind about whether he's the Son of God or not. Is a remarkable revolution without a shot being fired. Is one death. Well, no, that's not strictly true, but you know what I mean. So, in other words, I do think that thought, that ideas of considerable value, and they do actually lead, if carefully directed, to quite a bit of change. Having said that, Philip, I also think that, for instance, your newspaper, the Manchester Guardian, it may have been an establishment newspaper, but the idea of liberalism at that particular junction of history, I don't know. I'm just surmising. It might well have represented what was a radical step, even though that radical step was not the attitude that the later Guardian takes or does take today. So I think that it is a whole mixture. But is the pen mightier than the sword? If we have to actually cast a ballot, I would say yes, it is. Although I doubt that Genghis Khan could read or write.
That's probably true. You see, if I may say so, you are mirroring exactly my mixed feelings about this. I think at the end, writings and oratory do achieve something, but it's a bloody battle along the way, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So the Manchester Observer openly declared itself to be a liberal, non-conformist, radical newspaper. So it set out its stall from literally day one, and it was therefore to the establishment an enemy. And then when it encouraged the likes of Henry Hunt to do what you say is the most powerful thing, which is to speak, that's when things went too far. Because Hunt was very much a wanted man. I mean, by the time the massacre happened, there was in fact a parliamentary warrant out for his arrest, because a government spy had intercepted a letter that he had sent to a radical group in London, and they allowed the letter to carry on to identify the recipients, but the letter was copied, and ultimately he was prosecuted for, and there's a very fine line between sedition and treason, particularly in those days.
Yes.
So they were literally playing with fire, literally. And when you look at, as I did in the research, when you look at, it was an army. Not I don't mean the protesters. I mean there were regular troops.
Yeah.
There were the dragoons. There were the hussars. There were the yeomanry, who were basically shopkeepers who just got pissed. And then the special constabulary. So this was Tiananmen Square. This was Tiananmen Square in terms of David and Goliath.
Yeah, in
my view. So we have so many sad comparisons in modern times. The civil rights movement in America. You would have been in Canada, I imagine.
Indeed.
During a lot of that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I was. In fact, both the radio station that I worked at in Vancouver, or one of the two that I worked at, we actually had people who had decamped from the United States, so they didn't have to do national service in Vietnam. Now, is the Vietnam War, as Stuart Dolby on our station, who actually was out covering it, would say is the one very much is entwined with the other, and it was an interesting period. But if I could, just as an aside, because you know I'm famous for my red herrings, Philip, is there is a docudrama made of that period when the thousands gathered in front of the White House, and they show Bobby and Jack standing together looking, and Jack says to Bobby, "Jesus, Bobby, look at this. What the hell do we do?" And Bobby says, "What we normally do, Jack, nothing." And and I think that in some ways the establishment allow protesters to actually eat themselves rather than get totally involved. Now, my second red herring is that I very much when people and they do today this is wrong, that's wrong, we should do this and we should do that, and I always say use Fabian tactics. Fabius being, of course, the general who actually sniped at the rear of Hannibal when he was approaching Rome and looked as if he was going to take it, and the Roman armies just couldn't stop Hannibal. But Fabius hid in the hills and kept on coming out and attacking the tail, attacking the weak points and the weak points, until in the end he stopped Hannibal from attacking Rome. And I believe that sort of tactic, for which the pen can be a very useful tool, is a good way of operating things today. And if I may say so, this television station, in a very small way, does that. You know, I mean, we are quite straightforward when we don't like something and saying so. And I'm not saying that we've made any great inroads in changing anything, but just a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. And while Fabius did that with troops, you can't do that with violence today. You can only do it with the written word. So that's where I think that the pen or the word can be mightier than the use of violence or force.
Yes, well, it's important, isn't it, to understand what was meant by what Jefferson wrote to Paine and what was said in the play
You froze there, Philip. If you could repeat that.
Right. It's important to look at the true meaning of the phrase. What the phrase is saying is not to the authorities, be peaceful. We know you're going to do us in, but eventually we'll get there because our protests will not involve violence. That's the message. I mean, I mentioned the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. He was treated abominably. And as for the march they went on, eventually, by trying and trying again, they were crossing a certain bridge somewhere in the southern states. And every time they tried to cross it, they were beaten up by the troopers. And then a governor made the decision to let them through. And I saw a reenactment of this on the television, which I assume was relatively accurate, who knows, whereby the troopers yet again, with their batons raised, were at the end of the bridge. Luther King was leading the people. They weren't all black. There were some whites in there as well. And as they reached the end of the bridge, this time, because the troop leader had been given the order, he shouts out, "Troopers, stand by." And the troopers withdrew. leaving the way clear. But what happened next? Do you know?
No, but I suspect that there's a violence that they came back and battered them.
No, au contraire. Luther King turned his back on the troopers, said to the people, effectively, we've won the day, we can go home now. And the point he was making was that they had achieved the right to carry on if he'd have chosen, but he chose to make the point that the retreat of the troopers was what they were trying to achieve.
Yeah.
Now, I'm assuming that's...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, it's interesting that you should raise Martin Luther King the way that you have, and you're very perceptive, as indeed perhaps a legal man would be about that time, because I did live through that in North America, and I was in Seattle when he was assassinated, and the nation now Seattle is in Washington State, on the very northwest corner.
Yeah.
Of the United States, and is radically right wing. I mean, it is radically Republican, and everybody was absolutely dumbfounded, and saying in the streets, my God, what is our country coming to? So the nation was very severely affected in a way that perhaps you wouldn't have expected by that death.
Yes, well, I do remember the Kennedy assassinations, and I do remember Martin Luther more than any of them, really. There's a photograph I've seen from Time magazine whereby he's in his front garden extinguishing a burning cross, which of course is a symbol of the Klan. And he had to put up with that, as did his family, all of his life.
Yes.
I mean, it is still said, isn't it, that America is probably still the most racist country around.
And I would think that that's probably right. Is Melissa Conti, who comes on a Friday, as you know.
Yes.
It points out. I mean, she's talking about Trump and his phenomena at the moment, but that you've got a fairly sophisticated populace on the East Coast, Washington, New York, Boston, and reasonably sophisticated on the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and so on. But in between, there is this huge hinterland of people that really are not that sophisticated and not that educated, for that matter, and that they actually think quite differently. And the term redneck still applies to a fair chunk of the population.
Yeah. You mentioned Trump. Well, if there was ever a modern example of how rabble-rousing can become extremely dangerous, it was his obvious encouragement for the Capitol riots.
Yes.
And what those people thought they were consciously doing by literally hitting at the heart of that country's democracy.
Yes, indeed.
And
yes, go on.
With murderous intent.
Yeah. Now, Philip, I said to you in the email that I think that is very appropriate. I worry, along with other. I mean, you're getting to know me, and I'm full of anomalies, but I don't have any isms. I don't care what anybody is. I don't care their color, their creed, their ethnicity, sexuality, or whatever. It really doesn't bother me. I either like people for what they stand for or not, or whether they're decent people. Those are my. But taking that stance, for instance, I was appalled during the lockdown to receive an email from my local council saying, it wasn't to me particularly, basically what it said was, now listen, if you are hiding any money and you haven't paid your council tax, let us tell you that through the Freedom of Information Act, through the act that governs the internet and so on, is we can look at your bank account. Now, that to me is the sort of thing that the pen should be railing against, and yet it doesn't seem to excite people at all. That
it would have excited me. That's unheard of. I've never ever had. I can assure you, I've never had in my life a letter from a local council such as that.
Well, I actually, it worried me. And I actually did. You tell me the exact name of the act, because at my age, some specifics escape me. But the thing that actually is supposed to protect you from information on the internet. For instance,
data protection.
Data protection. That's the one I'm after. Yeah. I mean, for instance, if you fell down in the street and went to hospital, if I go to hospital and I say, I want to see Philip, they say, are you a relative? No, then you can't see him, because of the Data Protection Act means that it might actually, he might not approve of that sort of thing. Now, it's meant to protect us, but in fact, that very act works against us. And I couldn't believe that this was true. But sure enough, there is an exemption in that act. I actually did look it up when I saw it. And it gives local councils the power to use it to get into your house, as it were. Now, that actually strengthened my resolve to be rather nasty about local government and so on. If they have that power and they were prepared to use it, then I don't have any confidence in them. And I am known as saying, as a matter of fact, I sometimes start off this television program by saying 650 MPs in the House of Commons, and I wouldn't give you tuppence for any of them. I'm not really talking about their competence or not, is that we are going along with an awful lot of things which actually are replicated in a modern sense. Exactly what you've just been outlining is 100, 150 years ago.
Yes, well, the letter you received was a bullying letter. It horrifies me that it came from any institution that is deemed to be representative of the community. Now, that gentleman who used to run the sweet and tobacco shop, who's no longer with us, was he on the council at that time?
He was an independent. And actually he was one bright light in a very mediocre set of people. He understood how a council operated. He operated within the law, but he was always being very critical. I mean, he was, if you like, somebody. He was a Tom Paine, a local Tom Paine. The other thing that I went to, it's two council meetings now ago, so 6 or 7 years ago. But the Tories were in power in this council, and they basically the leader said, those in favour, and it was as if a string was pulled and the hands went up, all of them. Right?
No.
Let the string go down.
Yeah.
But the opposition was who's against, pull the string and the hands went up. there were two independents, and I'll name the other one because she was a bit of a controversial character as well, but she was a very good independent here, Ruth O'Keefe. There was Ruth, and there was the Councillor Kathleen Stephen, and they were the only two to actually question what was being done. The rest was just, and I suspect that it's very much the same today. I haven't been to a council meeting recently, but I don't find any leadership. I don't find any attack on what anybody is trying to do or saying, and of course, the local media has been swallowed up by the money men. So there is nobody to really challenge them except us guys.
Well, I think it's time that firstly you change your name to Henry Hunt, and secondly you open a newspaper called the Lewis Observer, and you state within it that you have a radical, independent political agenda to ensure that the local representatives of the people behave themselves and do it democratically.
Well, actually, Philip, I suppose that we're indulging in some radical talk now, but I don't mind. The big problem there, of course, is that what the establishment have done is that they've encouraged youngsters particularly, but it's creeping throughout their society, is not to read. They don't read things. Now, it is interesting that the politicians in this town, in this district, avoid coming on television because they claim that they do everything through the internet. But nobody reads. Nobody reads. They put this stuff up on the internet. They say, there, we told you on the internet. Right? And at the same time, they, if you'll excuse the expression, screwed up the educational system. So it needs radical thought. And I like to think that perhaps with a little bit of financial backing is we could make this television station much more attractive pictorially, because in the long run, television is a lot to do with moving pictures. We are very lucky to have the caliber of persons such as you and Richard and Harry Atherton from France and Dr. Maybe from Stoke-on-Trent. People of tremendous intellectual capacity. We're very lucky, but we need to build on that and make ourselves a force. Ooh, how do I get onto this in the morning? Well done, Philip.
Well, it's my fault yet again. Everything is my fault, Keith. I don't know where I get that from, but everything is my fault. But I wouldn't even call it radical. We're not talking about changing a system. We're talking about fine-tuning how a system should work.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm not. Actually, I had this debate on Friday, or a little discussion with Melissa, comparing the American system with ours. And I said, actually, both of them follow Plato in his Republic, who said the best form of government is monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. We have that. And actually, in a funny sort of way, the Americans have it with the president, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. And actually, that system does work quite well, even though it was thought up 2,000 years ago. But if it is followed and not tampered with.
Well, all I was going to say, you mean your description of the puppet on a string council meetings. I find the American houses similar to that. It's very rare, isn't it, that ranks are broken? Very rare.
Yes, that's very true. As a matter of fact, my own personal theory, which turned a bit sour, I must say, was is that the Republicans had become so establishment, and the Democrats had become so establishment, that the American public were looking for something a bit radical, and that's why they went to Trump, which turned out to be perhaps an experiment a wee bit too far. But the sad thing is that my view, and I'm viewing it from 5,000 miles away, is that they've gone back to the old system when the radical failed to deliver.
There doesn't appear to be any room for radicalism over there. It seems to have been effectively snuffed out. And
yes.
Everything seems to be about, well, it's drawn on racial lines. All I ever read or hear is whether it's the Afro-Caribbeans, the Hispanics, the Caucasians, that seems to be, they are their labels, they are their points of description. And it's whether those policies affect well or not well each of those groups.
Yes.
It surprised me hugely to learn that down in Florida, Trump has huge Hispanic support. Hispanic support. But
then they've got DeSantis down there, who is very much an evangelist type character. He's got quite a lot of support too, or did have.
But again, Trump opened his mouth about him, didn't he? And was very, very rude about him.
Yes.
Calling him de-sanctimonious. The man is an animal, Trump. He just opens his mouth.
Yes, yes.
And what horrifies me is what I think will happen is that he'll be Teflon man, and he'll come through all of these trials and tribulations, and he'll be the president again and claim that he was always right.
Yeah.
And he has survived the worst political headhunt in history.
Yes. Well, actually, talking to fairly sane and sensible and knowledgeable people like Melissa and Suzanne and so on and so forth, is I think that you're absolutely right, and I think that their feeling is that. But Philip, what really bothers me is that there is a large element of that creeping into this country. For instance, I see on social media from people I would otherwise perhaps respect their opinions it's the Tories' fault, and that they are elite and that they're wealthy and so on and so forth. And nothing could be further from the truth. But then on the other side is anybody who is a teeny wee bit socialist is a commie. How on earth have we got to those extreme points of view? And if we, starting on your thesis, if as using the pen, a la the television camera and the microphone, is trying to ameliorate that situation a little bit and to try to bring some element of moderation into the debate, then perhaps we'll have started something.
Yes, well, what you're telling me, because I don't do social media at all, you do for the television and for your own interest. And it's a source of evil in many ways, because it allows people who normally wouldn't have the guts to stand up and say what they're saying face to face. They just put it on a text, put it on an email, put it on Facebook. Everybody's an easy target.
Yeah.
And social media, and it's very much the same in the sporting world. I wonder why many of these athletes, particularly footballers, bother with social media, because they are just attacked.
Absolutely, and I think that it's something that you're going to have to come to grips with. Don't ask me to even provide a thesis at the moment, but I was reading just this morning that apparently Tom Curry, the rugby player, he
Yeah,
complained about a racial slur,
he
and
did.
his wife said that even while he was playing rugby, she was getting death threats on social media.
Yeah,
Now, I
I
mean,
read that.
yeah, and I mean that's absolutely appalling. But you and I can say it's appalling. Is how do we actually use the media that we've got, and which I'm happy to say with you and Richard particularly are developing into a very decent and articulate sort of a media. How do we use it to try and at least take the edge of that extremism? I
Well,
don't know, but I think about it every night before
well,
I lie awake and I think, what did we do today? What can we do tomorrow? How can we take this forward? And I'm not so sure that decent people aren't sort of ho hum, that they're not really aware of some of the evils around us, perhaps because they don't use social media. I don't know. But
well,
so they don't care.
it, you would have to be an ostrich with his head in the sand to not be aware, even just on the news, of how wicked social media can be. So if anybody were to claim to me that, oh, I had no idea it was used for that, I frankly wouldn't believe them.
Yeah.
The only way, and the media companies will not invest in it, and the government will not force them to, the only way is censorship. It's monitoring the filth that is passed along social media. Again, Mrs. Curry uses social media. Mrs. Rooney continued to use social media. They, in many ways, are their own worst enemies. I don't know how it works, how some body in the UK or in South Africa, wherever it may have come from, were sending Mrs. Curry death threats. How on earth did they know it was her?
Yes.
I mean, my wife, Jackie, is not an active member of Facebook, but she can access Facebook, but only to read what is written. Nobody can get to her directly.
Yeah.
So there is a middle way, and there's also monitoring.
Yes.
There's monitoring.
The trouble is, though, it also knows no bounds. It remind me of the name of the lady who was a Speaker of the House in America.
Pelosi.
Yeah, Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah, I just opened up a thing last night. I probably shouldn't have, but it was Nancy Pelosi asking me to send messages of support for her her stance on certain issues. Now, she wasn't asking me, and she just had no idea that it was coming to me here in the UK, where I have absolutely no power whatsoever. It was just a blanket. Let's send it out to everybody on email.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing as well. Is that there is no form. There's nothing to shape it. It's a blanket. Hey, do this, chaps. So yes, I think it is. You have to sort of say, is it a blessing or an evil of our time? And probably it's both. But if it's going to be a blessing, it's got to be curbed a little bit to make sure that the evil doesn't distance it.
Well, I'm of the view that the imbalance between the evil and the good is huge. I'm afraid, and people should only use it if they absolutely have to.
Yes.
You know, I've heard people in pubs, in particular, when I used to use the brewers, and people who you could pigeonhole as those who would use Facebook. But these guys were saying, for anybody who wants to listen, it is boring. You know, people are going on there imagining that what they had for dinner last night is important to the world. You know, and these guys had just stopped using it because they said it was just so banal.
Yes. But by the same token, when I sort of raise that issue, Philip, people say, "Well, Keith, what do you use?" And of course, if you took it to extremes, we wouldn't be doing this.
True. I know the concept of any censorship will be extremely unpopular, but there simply has to be a way with proper funding for at least some of this filth to be stopped.
Yes, I agree.
And one thing is insulting somebody and threatening them emptily with death. Another thing is recruiting victims for paedophilia.
Yeah.
We really are going into the dark arts there, commonly known as the dark web.
I totally agree. And the only thing I would say is that in some ways, what social media has done is it has highlighted a lot of the things that were under the table. One of the issues was how we treated homosexuality. It was treated in a series such as Foyle's War, a series that I thoroughly enjoyed. I don't know whether you liked it, but they raise these social issues from time to time in these drama series. I have to sit back and sort of say, yeah, well, it's always existed, this attitude towards so and so. It's just been under the table. Now what we're seeing is it's laid out like a feast, and like the poor man at a feast. Where do you start?
I mean, again, mentioning my wife, she watches certain programs all the time, and one of them is EastEnders. Now, I personally can't stand EastEnders, and I've often asked, "What is it, Jackie? As an intelligent person, educated person, what is it? Who is from London, yes, but from a very, very posh and privileged upbringing in London? What is it that fascinates you about this apparent life in the East End?" And her answer is always the same, because it highlights social issues. And she believes that EastEnders is the best of a genre of such programs that highlight social issues, and she may well be right.
Yes. Well, actually, strangely enough, I'm addicted to Heartbeat, which, although it takes place in the country, it brings up similar social issues, and that's why I suppose I would argue that I watch it.
Heartbeat stopped ages ago, didn't it?
Oh yeah, but it's replayed now
from
series 1 through to series 27. They've got about 20 years worth left.
I used to like Heartbeat a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. In fact, I could even sing the theme tune. I'm not going to, but I can remember the theme tune. I think we've put the world to rights.
As usual, an excellent choice of topic. It's taken us down a number of avenues, but all I think worth talking about. And once again, is we don't mind sticking our head up against over the parapet. Some people will watch us this morning and say, "What idiots!" Others will say, "Yes, it needs to be said." But I think that needs to be said is the predominant thing. So let us say that the pen in this particular case is mightier than the sword.
Yes, well, as long as we keep, Keith, you and me, to the boulevards and the avenues and not the cul-de-sacs.
Yes.
I'll say goodbye, Keith.
Yes. Thank you. We won't see you on next month, next Friday. Is that right?
It very much depends. I'm saying no because we have to get to London for lunchtime.
Right. Yeah.
And it would be a bit of a. I mean, if Richard were doing it as well, I could just tap in for a while, but I couldn't do this again like today.
Well, let's we've got a week stretching ahead of us. Let's see how things play out.
Well, send me a link. Send me a link anyway.
Yeah,
and I'll at least perhaps say hello.
All right.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Have a good
Bye-bye,
day.
Keith.
Bye. Well, there we are. It was some session this morning, and the beer is being pulled behind me, I think. Oh, he's gone. Just as I'm able to actually belly up to the bar, even though it is at the moment it is 9:01 on the morning of the 30th of October, 2023, and it's a mixed day today. But I tell you one thing is it's cool. So if you're going to go out, wrap up. I'll be back in about 5 minutes or so to take a look at the news before we actually go to France and Harry Ashton. All right, for the moment then, let's say toodle pip. If I can, if I can find the appropriate thing. I don't know why I can never find this particular one. There we go. All right. Be back shortly.